Everyone, I'm John Bruner. I'm the program chair of the O'Reilly Solid Conference, and with us today on this Hangout we have a couple of speakers from Solid who also happen to be authors of a terrific new book that just came out last week called The Hardware Startup. Renee DiResta is the Vice President for Business Development at Haven, which connects startups and other companies that need shipping with spare capacity and takes care of their logistics. And we also have Ryan Vinyard, who's the engineering lead at Highway 1, which is a hardware accelerator incubator attached to PCH, the big supply chain company. Welcome, both of you. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So in the hardware startup, you're talking about something sort of new, right? This idea of a hardware startup that looks a lot like a software startup. What has changed in the last few years that's made this a phenomenon?
Well, actually, we have a report coming out called Hardware by the Numbers. I think that's going to be out on O'Reilly's site on Friday. That looks at that development, particularly over the last 5 years or so, and really digs into the numbers. I mean, you see this very sharp uptick in around 2011. Really, the maker movement started to attract a lot of attention, and then after that, I think people started to really realize that building a physical product was something that they could do. There had been previously, you'd seen Eric Rees, the startup, who had pushed along this idea of doing a software startup, of entrepreneurship as a career. And I think it took a little while longer to percolate into hardware because investors were a bit more wary. But we've really seen a huge rise in the number of people starting hardware companies over the last 3 years.
Yeah, and I think crowdfunding has had a big impact on that as well. The ability to get your ideas out there earlier, the physicality, visual effect of the crowdfunding campaigns, I think has really helped benefit hardware startups and get them out there. While at the same time you have all the back-end support from tech shop, Arduino, prototyping has become so much more accessible, like Renee was alluding to. So I think the confluence of those two factors has really helped all hardware startups move forward faster.
Yeah, crowdfunding is an interesting development. I think we often talk about sort of the technical advances that have made this stuff possible, like the prototyping tools that people love talking about, 3D printing and stuff like that. But the marketing and distribution tools have changed really dramatically as well. And crowdfunding is just part of it, right?
Well, one thing that we actually cover in the Hardware by the Numbers report this year is the really interesting trend that we've seen in crowdfunding over the past 5 years, which is the entire duration that it's been around. Matt Withiler of Flybridge, he's a VC in New York. He does fantastic work on this, really kind of mapping out sector by sector within crowdfunding, breaking down what products are being funded, who's doing what. But one of the trends that we uncovered actually was the shift where previously crowdfunding was something that startups did before taking VC funding or before going into an incubator. It was kind of like almost like a proof point for getting to that conversation. Whereas now that's really flipped, and now what you see is if you look at the actual more companies really getting in there, and they've raised maybe 200,000 or so, or they have incubator money, and then they crowdfund after that as a go-to-market strategy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that
just about. Sorry, go ahead.
I think it really helps lower their risk and enable them just to go into that from a position of power. I mean, I think when crowdfunding started, like the Pebble example would be, it's essentially a hey, what if organic tooling budget, and I think it's really shifted from that to more of an orchestrated marketing campaign where people need to go and do it consciously. So I think that's something that kind of people in the Silicon Valley bubble and startup world are more aware of. But I think it's a trend that could hurt people outside that bubble who still see it as an organic launch platform.
So it's become not an organic launch platform, or talk about some of the
launch platform, but I think it's more something people go and do consciously. Before it was kind of testing the waters, and we see at Highway 1 we're encouraging people to do that with beta runs, get 30 physical prototypes in people's hands, lower risk areas there where you can actually get that MVP out there, get feedback on feature sets or the whole product is this what I should be making before you go to the crowdfunding and really launch your first product. Whereas before, I feel like the crowdfunding itself was the testing the waters.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think also as crowdfunding has morphed into this launch, it's really, if you look at, in the book, we did a couple of case studies on this. We looked at Sunny View of Misfit. Really, amazing, just brilliantly executed launch where he actually shared with us his timeline. And it was just the most incredibly precise, like on this day it's going to launch, these are the tweets we're going to send out, these are the people who are going to write the articles. On this day we're going to reevaluate our data, maybe we're going to add another color to the product offering. And he did a phenomenally well-orchestrated campaign, and I think that was one of the earlier ones, really. That was in terms of launching a wearable in Indiegogo. And what we've seen since then is we've seen PR companies pop up that exist almost entirely to help that crowdfunding raise. We've seen really great talented people like Sandwich Video who are producing kind of fairly big budget, if you're a startup, marketing materials for these campaigns.
So tell me, it sounds incredibly risky to have a go-to-market plan that's that detailed, all the way down to sort of like when you're going to release different colors. Hardware is a little bit trickier to deploy than software. Things get stuck in customs. Things turn out not to be, producible at the cost you'd anticipated. Is that still the case, or how does a plan like that mesh with sort of the real world in doing the engineering and production and distribution?
I mean, what I would say for that is there's still not a science to the crowdfunding launch. There's still not every consumer product one should be this long, it'll take this long to get to market. But I think part of what Renee is saying as well is there's trends that we can't ignore anymore. There's certain things that people have learned in terms of how long does it take to get my supply chain. Hey, I should actually be talking and setting up my supply chain before the launch, and that'll actually make it stronger. The videos that have that in there, and they're talking about, hey, we already have a manufacturing partner, that's why we need the money for this tooling budget, and it's all part of that trend. I think that's a lot of what gives people more confidence when seeing a crowdfunding campaign, because that's what's going to help them get to market faster. So, I think some of those trends are unavoidable to see, and I think that people taking advantage of engaging in the manufacturing supply chain beforehand are having bigger launches and faster time to market. I think that there's always going to be a bit of a haze on crowdfunding in terms of timing, but I think that people are getting closer to that, and I think that the campaigns that are more confident on that have become more successful ones.
Yeah, and I think, again, Matt, just to give another shout out to his research, he did a really excellent study that I think he posted to TechCrunch a couple weeks ago, and it was all about how much funding had been taken relative to relative to how delayed the product was. So it was not that it was not delayed. It was like on the spectrum of how delayed, where it fit in. And he made a really nice graph, and I would definitely encourage anybody watching this interested to Google his stuff, because it's great.
And that's a good point, because I think that a problem people have seen that was unforeseen on the hardware side is it's actually the huge raises, the $1 million, $10 million Kickstarter funds that are becoming harder to fulfill, because that really kicks you into, hey, I looked at my supply chain for a $100,000 launch. I don't know how I was going to do $1 million launch. I was setting up for that. That's a different factory, different supply chain, different scale, and potentially even different manufacturing processes once they're at that scale. So yeah. I think that's one of those good problems to have that people are seeing more and more.
But that forces you immediately into the kind of the scale of a full-size electronics manufacturer, right? You have to skip the kind of the easier, the more agile steps that you would usually get to enjoy on the way up.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about having these raises happen after entrance into an accelerator is there's a lot more experience backing the entrepreneurs who are doing the crowdfunding campaigns. So that's where I think the real value add of someone like Highway 1, I know Hackcelerator's Cyril's written about this also, but just having that expertise where they can go ahead and say, we have experts like Brian here, or like Brady, who unfortunately couldn't join us, backstopping this campaign. We're not just two guys in a proverbial garage.
Yeah, exactly. And as Renee says, that's something we advise startups on a lot when they come into the program. Very common, we have a startup coming in saying, hey, I'm going to crowdfunding in a month, and we say, great, do you have the full campaign set up and parallel staff members to support that campaign? Well, no, we thought we'd just throw it up there. And we said, then no, you're not going to crowdfunding. So we really like to help people orchestrate that launch, make sure the timing makes sense, making sure they're making use of the accelerator that they're in, whether that's on engineering development, lowering the risk on the other side. And that's why it's become more important for us to kind of align with teams on their launch and make sure that we can help make sure they're in a really strong position when they go into that and they get what they want out of it. Different teams go to crowdfunding for different reasons. A lot of it's money, obviously. Some of it's cash in the bank, and some of it's money just to show traction, just to show that other people who I've never heard of will give us their credit card numbers, and that's really the risk they're trying to lower. So we just want to make sure they're going in with a conscious approach to know what they're trying to get out of it, and they're supported to get there.
So let's think through kind of the process of a hardware startup as it compares to a software startup. What is your, you've identified an idea, a place in the market for a particular product. What do the steps start to look like after that? Do you go into a professional industrial designer and have prototypes worked up? Do you go to a tech shop? Like, what is the very basic sort of starting point for a lot of the companies that you both see?
I mean, I think a lot of that depends on what the emphasis of the company is, right? Like a phrase we use a lot and VCs use too is just risk. So is the risk in your startup technology? You have a brand new technology coming out of a lab that's going to be different than any other product. Is the risk in your product really the design and experience? Hey, it's just another IoT sensor, but we have a different way of approaching that. Or is it something like supply chain, which could also affect the IoT sensor startup? So I think it's really identifying, and for those examples, I would say if you have a super tech thing coming out of a lab, you need to nail that down. You need to have a bunch of white papers showing this is completely defensible, it works, and there's a patent portfolio that shows it works. Whereas if it's really on the differentiations on the supply chain or design side, it's really just kind of establishing, hey, can we get enough differentiation there? Our design is so unique that no one could ever, you're not going to have a fast follower to come right after you. On the supply chain side, maybe it's specific arrangements with the vendor. You're the only one that can get that sensor, whatever it is. But I think it's just pursuing what's different in your startup and making sure you have that locked down before you start, asking more people, whether that's investors, partners, co-founders, employees, to take a risk on your startup as well.
Yeah. A lot of the startups, to just go off one of your points there, a lot of the startups that I think we see today are fundamentally about the software that's inside some piece of hardware or a cloud service behind it, and the hardware is extending their software into some place where the software hasn't been before. That's following a pretty clear path of differentiation through software. We understand kind of how differentiation through software works. How difficult is it to differentiate through the actual hardware, to have that chip that only you are able to get, or to have some real sort of really novel engineering feature in your hardware that no one else will be able to reproduce? That sounds heavyweight.
Yeah. I mean, I think the short answer is you can definitely get exclusive relationships with suppliers. If there's a sensor that's really core to your product and they see the value that you're the team that can bring that product to market, an OEM might be willing to engage in that with you. On the hardware side, I think a lot of it's just becoming the unified brand that people trust for that product. Part of it you can protect in hardware with patents and all that, but a lot of it's just being the first brand to market that has really strong design and user experience and commitment to customer support, so that when things come up, you show them that you're really the people leading that space.
Yeah. So what from Renee's perspective, sort of you wrote the sections of the book that were a little bit on the more sort of business orientation side. Where do you see the sort of the key early steps for people who are thinking about hardware startups?
Well, so one of the things that we talk about a lot, first there's the marketing and branding piece of it. And it's because no matter how great your technology is or how innovative your product is, you still have to sell it to somebody. And so a lot of what we talk about, what we things that we see is sort of if we build it, they will come attitude, particularly in the early days, particularly when crowdfunding was a story. I mean, Pebble is a fantastic product, and they also happen to, I think, be the first crowdfunding campaign to break 10 million, maybe it was. But they were one of the first really big ones, and they were a story alongside crowdfunding being a story, so they got kind of a double bump on that. As crowdfunding stopped being a story, A lot of times I would have conversations with founders, and they would say, well, we're going to launch on Kickstarter, and then we're going to get press for that. And they would say, it's not really a story anymore. Everybody's doing it. It's not unique. What's your go-to-market strategy? What's really innovative? I think as you evaluate go-to-market strategy, you're evaluating sales channel strategy as well, and that has to be part of it. And along with that comes pricing strategy. So we actually spend a fair amount of time in the book talking about how to set a price. If you're going to go into a retail channel and you're going to be on, if you're targeting big box, for example, you're going to be giving up somewhere between 30 and 50% in margin. You're also going to have to produce a quantity sufficient to actually, that when they hand you that purchase order, you're going to have to be able to actually go out and produce it. You're going to have to be able to import it here. There's a number of things that are, costs that a lot of times people just don't think about it. I remember talking to one robotics company that said, oh, we're just going to, we're going to do our Kickstarter, and then we're going to assemble these in our kitchen and pay our friends pizza, And it's really like and I'm not knocking that. I think that that's actually an outgrowth of the kind of maker ethos underlying the whole thing. I was just, as we talked about, are you doing a project or a product? Are you doing a project or a company? If you're doing a company and you're going to go out looking for venture funding, what's your vision? What's your longer term plan look like? And that ties into even your business plan. For example, if your plan is just to sell your widget, then you have kind of one revenue point, and then you kind of hope that you're bringing that customer in 2 years from now again when you release an update, or which Apple can do, but not a whole lot of other people are doing kind of every 2-year turnover on every consumer product they own. So a lot of what we talk about in the book is how to tie all these things together and really consistently. If your price point is $200, who are you marketing to? What marketing channels are you going for? What's your customer profile look like at $99 versus at $200 versus some of these things which honestly start out around $400, and then you're kind of marketing a luxury good almost at that point. So what we try to do is, it's very complicated. It's a lot of moving parts, and it's something where having a strong kind of either advice or business chops or advisory relationships in from day one helps founders to not make those mistakes.
You raise a really good point about things that only Apple can do. And by the way, I just want to cut in and tell people who are listening that if you have a question for Renee or Ryan, you can tweet with the hashtag IoT profiles, or just tweet at me or at O'Reilly Solid. And we'll send your question along. So you raise a good point about things that only Apple can do, and I think it's a funny kind of like conversation point that at software conferences there's always this huge interest in like how does Google do it and what does Google do. In a way, that's like a completely irrelevant question for a lot of people because Google's ability to develop software and to deploy it is just unparalleled, and it's not a useful example for anyone else. I feel like you often hear people talking about Apple in the same way. They have armies of engineers, DFM people, just layers and layers of suppliers that they're able to exert enormous pressure on to get things done. So perhaps they aren't a useful example for a lot of startups in particular, but even much larger companies that haven't built the kinds of supply chains and distribution networks that they have. So talk a little bit about some companies that you do think are good examples for hardware startups or things that are useful targets, useful ideas.
Yeah, I'll take the Apple example for a second. I mean, I definitely agree with you, John. That's something people forget is, it can take 30 engineers at Apple just to get the magic whoosh of your out-of-box experience. So just because a startup wants that doesn't mean they necessarily want to pay for that. So
the magic whoosh, by the way, tell the listeners what that is.
Which I love. I mean, it's all part of the experience. And I think the way that I would say that is we have a lot of startups that come into the program that say, well, heck, I got to launch it at $400 anyway because that's where my BOM is. So, let's make it high-end. Let's make it Apple quality. What would be the top quality we could do on all this? And we start to look at the team and say, okay, well, here's the processes that will be available. And then we start to look at that BOM cost, and they say, oh, wow, now I priced myself into an $800 product or whatever it ends up being. So I think that they can be a good anchor because they're doing such high-quality product at scale out there. And what I look to there is to say, look, yes, they can throw engineers at a problem that a startup can't, but they're not using any processes that aren't out there for everyone. The high emergence of CNC in manufacturing, the high use of adhesives, a lot of those things that they're doing to collapse the cycle are things available to all of us. Now, startup can't do it at that quality and obviously quantity that Apple's selling at, but I do think there's a lot that people can learn there from looking at them as a forerunner and the DFM and go-to-market time for things. So I think there's a lot to be learned there, but I think startups can get scared by the scale and cost of what they're really doing.
I'd like to just touch on the supply chain piece for a second, because we haven't brought that up. Shameless plug, one of Haven's co-founders came out of Apple's supply chain, and it was his experiences at Apple's supply chain that kind of led to one of the foundational principles of the company, which is this idea that while Haven is a platform that can be used by companies of all sizes, the idea is really, Apple has this amazing ability to it really controls its supply chain from start to finish. It controls the pricing, the product, the terms at which its goods are sold, the prices at which they're sold, factory management, et cetera. It has people on the floor. That's another thing I don't think we've touched on. But just where you manufacture is a very major decision because if you don't have people physically on the floor in your factory, then things kind of you can speak to this better than I, kind of go off the rails at times. With Haven, what we do is we say, it's ocean freight. The difference between ocean freight and air freight is that it's about a 5x markup to ship via air versus to ship via ocean, which when you're kind of scraping pennies, that's potentially quite significant. If you're importing something heavy, that's extremely significant. If you're importing something large or bulky, ocean is really, it's kind of the only game. And yet at the same time, the flip side is it takes about 3 weeks to import via ocean versus 1 week to import via air. So I know PCH, we have slightly different opinions on this. I know PCH really strongly advocates for air. Haven strongly advocates for ocean. but the point is, there are kind of platforms that are coming into play. The same way originally there was this wave of new machining tools, additive manufacturing, subtractive technology, functional prototyping platforms that helped with the production of the goods. Now we're seeing kind of this rise in logistics startups that recognize that the end of the supply chain is also a very major component. So with Haven, we basically say we allow you to connect with ocean freight carriers directly, the same way Apple does. So you can go in there and bid for capacity the same way Apple does. And so that's the way that we try to modernize the supply chain in such a way that accessibility and democratization is brought to SMB companies as well.
Yeah, and I'd like to come on touch on a couple points there. The air freight one's an interesting one because I think something startups are seeing more and more common is more blended supply chains. So there's not kind of one finite answer for your entire supply chain. So I mentioned that in terms of air because there can be things where hey, maybe everything's in the pack-out facility or at the end of the supply chain in the warehouse. Maybe you do need to air freight those first few thousand units to get to your early backers, to get to the first orders, and then put everything else on a boat. So that's not to say that it's always air or always boat, first of all, but I think something else I want to touch on is I think people are learning more and more about the existence of supply chains. So that's something that just wasn't really a topic 10, 15 years ago, and I think that there's a perception among engineers and entrepreneurs that you kind of have one magic factory that everything pops out at the end, and you just go to them and they get everything behind them. So that's obviously something PCH is strong in, is figuring out that whole supply chain and what's the right supply chain value. But that's something we educate people coming into Highway 1 all the time. Is part of our program is we bring them to Shenzhen for 10 days to give them exposure. And a question we often get is, well, why are we going to 7 different factories? Can't I just go to the one that makes my widget? Well, that's where we're bringing you to 7 factories to show you that it takes 7 factories minimum your widget at the end of the supply chain. So I think more knowledge of that has become more common, but that's a lot of our job is helping people understand. Great. So now that exists, where do I need to touch base? Do I need to be in all 7 factories? Do I just need to be in the final assembly point? Where do I put my resources as a cash-strapped startup to make sure the quality is high and I'm adding value to my supply chain?
Right. So that kind of leads me to my next set of questions about how deep a hardware startup needs to go in the manufacturing and DFM processes to get everything right. It is not, as you mentioned, a single factory that pushes everything out. Earlier you mentioned the magic whoosh from Apple, and that refers to the precise tolerances with which their boxes are made, right? So that there's a satisfying kind of like suction as you lift the lid off. Is that right?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So it's you're referring to like the level of involvement at Apple that goes all the way towards specifying exactly how the box needs to work so that the out-of-box experience is flawless. And I've talked with other folks at PCH, and I think probably both of you at various points about things like, if you don't take packaging into account from the very beginning, you're going to end up with something that doesn't fit in a box that fits, in a Target shelf or something. So how deep do hardware startups need to go to understand this stuff? I mean, there isn't a single button, but what is out there in the way of like an abstracted sort of interface to this?
Yeah, I guess I'll start that one. I mean, the two things I would say is, startups need to evaluate where they see the highest risk in their supply chain. Again, are they doing something new? Is there a new vendor that hasn't been vetted? And that's the sensor that's core to their product. So, putting resources at that, and then also where can you add value to your supply chain? So, if you don't have a lot of background in that, it's probably not going to help to get super involved in the nitty-gritty logistics if there's not anything different there. Like the example I would use is, if you're a cash-strapped startup and you start out your project by spending a bunch of time on the out-of-box whoosh, you might be ignoring resources to get the actual sensors working on the PCBA 2 steps up the supply chain. So I think at first it's really just seeing where's the risk, where can you add value, where are the bottlenecks, because you're going to be setting up something new. So basically just triaging resources to the high-value areas, and that's A, based on the design that and B, once you start to set up your supply chain, what's making you uneasy and where do you see the risk. So, getting as involved as you can in the risky areas would be my biggest piece of advice for new entrepreneurs.
And I think we've seen, we have a couple of case studies in the book. I think Monkey Electric is one of them, where those guys have actually been to, I think, 3 different countries at this point. I think they've done US, China, and Mexico. And they talk about the pros and cons of each. I believe last time I spoke with them, the way that they had things set up was some of the pieces were being manufactured in Fremont and some were being manufactured in China. And so what that let them do was kind of, they did the final assembly in, I believe over in Berkeley, in the factory in Berkeley. And so there was this even from, at a small to mid-sized kind of hardware company that was fulfilling on a regular basis, they were they already had a fairly sophisticated supply chain. They had been down in Mexico, and I think that they had felt slightly uncomfortable with some of the politics around the factory that they'd chosen and the way workers were treated, which is something that that many people obviously should consider. So there's interesting series of conversations that we have with people in the book about where did you manufacture and why.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about sustainability that you're referring to there. Big companies can have enough leverage, it would seem, that they can sort of insist on sustainable practices, good working environments, environmental care. What sort of position are startups in on those kinds of things? Are they stuck working with factories, that might be bad to their workers or bad for the environment?
I mean, I think the short answer on that is back to what I was saying about what are the risks or values of the company. If sustainability is a core interest in your company and that's something that you want to potentially market and at the very least defend in the long term, that might be something where there's always going to be a choice. You're always going to have different factors in terms of cost, quality, sustainability, the way they treat their workers. So I think that that's something just for a startup to have good conscious internal discussions with their founders to say, great, this is something, great, we all like sustainability. Well, how much? Is this a core value? Is this a secondary value? Is it something that we're willing to put money on right now, and are investors aligned with us on that? Do they agree that this is something that's going to build value in the company long term, and we can spend some extra resources on that? So, and there's also a couple of approaches there. I mean, one is to pick a factory or a supply chain that partner that already has those values. And the second, especially if you're stuck in a process or factory that's somewhat unique, is to go into a factory and try to increase those standards. So that's something that PCH does all the time through our green tech sustainability team, to say, hey, look, there's only one supplier for this. They're not up to our standards right now, but look, that's what we want to do is get their standards up. It's going to help, the factory, the startup, and PCH long term. and everyone should get a cut of that ROI. So, I think that's something that we do well, is helping get those standards up, but also tying it back to, return on investment and profitability, because that's what, a lot of the reason people want to improve those standards long term and short term.
Right, right. And so we have a question from Twitter. Ken Rother asks about local manufacturing in the U.S. Could you just talk about sort of what that entails? We've heard a lot about the idea of the return of manufacturing to the U.S. What does it take? What do you think about it? What do you think about from the perspective of a hardware startup? Should that be a consideration?
I can start on that a little bit. The example I would use is I came from a hardware startup, Motive Power Systems. They're currently setting up manufacturing in Hayward to scale, and I think a lot of that again comes down to being close to your supply chain, because they're doing a highly risky new technical area, but also the value that they have in sustainability and energy. Because it's an electric vehicle company, they need those values forefront. And they need to be manufacturing locally, also because they're making huge power supplies for buses. So I think a lot of it has to do with where's the risk and where's the scale. So something we see more common is larger things like medical devices. We see more common being set up in the U.S. before going overseas, either to Mexico or China. But I think something that's becoming more common is blended supply chains, startups doing their first run here, fulfill 1,000 units through Kickstarter. Maybe you're sourcing one, expensive sensor or PCB from China, but you start the assembly and pack out here to learn, is this even going to be a business before you run to China and try to scale?
I would agree with all that, and then I think we've also seen some warehousing as a service, companies that are handling specifically either the warehousing or the fulfillment or the kind of boxing and shipping to customers. We've seen that kind of done domestically as well. So people who are small teams, don't have a lot of space, don't have dedicated people working on that right now, looking at services like ShipWire or Flash to handle that kind of last mile fulfillment for them.
Do you have a sort of a rule of thumb for how costs compare these days between domestic electronics manufacturing and Chinese electronics manufacturing?
It's a good question. I don't have a magic number because it changes so quickly. But yeah, I think a lot of it's just whenever a startup's looking at the weight, the scale, and the complexity. I think that's something people misjudge, is they look at their BOM and say, hey, it's that expensive, let me go overseas, and they forget that they're trying to do something new or complex that might take them some NRE, investment in the line bring up.
Yeah, a few trips to Shenzhen is a lot of money to extend over a pretty small run, right? And if you're saying if you have something where you need your engineer to stand over the shoulder of an assembly line worker and correct things for a long time, then it makes sense to do at least the initial runs in the U.S.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that's to learn, what is different, what is hard about your product. Why is someone having a pain point trying to assemble it? That's going to be a lot easier, talking to someone locally and understanding that before you try to send it overseas. But I also think it's important for startups to look at where their scale is going to make sense long term. So because you're making 1,000 units this year for Kickstarter, if you really have visibility that you're making 100,000 units next year, you're going to be doing yourself a disservice setting up a small local manufacturing line that you just can't scale and ramp if you're going to be under the gun to really start cranking out units in the next year.
So Shenzhen and South China are usually the areas that people talk about when we look at manufacturing electronics overseas. Do you see people going to, at the same time, costs have been going up there, and a lot of the bigger manufacturers have been moving their factories to interior China or to Vietnam or Thailand. Have you seen startups starting to work in those places, or is Shenzhen pretty much the only overseas location that people are considering?
I haven't seen it heavily yet. I think a lot of that depends on, Bunny Huang is someone who we interviewed for the book, and he made a really good point about, the equations are the same. The equations for manufacturing and prototyping, it's the same that we've had since the 70s. The variables are just changing rapidly. So in terms of, the example he was using was CNC versus injection molding. So, as things like labor rates, material rates, and land costs change, I think you'll see some of those equations start to change and not be as China dependent. But I also think that so much of the equipment and knowledge base has moved to China. It's hard to figure out how to tool something if you're not in China at this point. So I think that the value just being in the cheap labor rates has changed a lot. And I think that's the part of the equation we're all going to have to figure out, where is really the best place moving forward, depending on the startup, the scale, the size, and where the supply chain is being shipped to eventually.
Yeah, and I think being in logistics, more broadly than electronic startups, I actually do see other types of startups, customers of ours that are manufacturing in other areas. And as we look at where apparel companies are manufacturing cosmetics, a number of other types of companies, a lot of that has actually moved out of China. And it's just because for lower margin goods, the global labor arbitrage really does come into play. Mm-hmm. So it'll be interesting to see over the next 3 to 5 years what winds up happening in electronics on that front.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but your point is that it's expertise and resources as much as costs driving this, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And when you're sort of thinking about the working with Shenzhen, again, where's the level at which you interact, at which the companies you're talking to are interacting with Shenzhen? Are they doing their DFM with engineers in Shenzhen? Are they doing DFM over here and then working at that level with the factories? Are they sending it to industrial designers in Shenzhen? Like the stack of expertise available in Shenzhen seems to be growing and moving toward the higher value stuff. So where do the companies you're talking with interact with that?
That's a good question. Maybe I can start that answer from the PCH side. So, Highway 1 is really the first touch point for startups within PCH, but a lot of our depth is on the manufacturing DFM, DFA details, and so that's something we try to expose the startups to. A lot of what we see is startups aren't really ready to go to Shenzhen and scale until they're at the 5,000, 10,000, well beyond Kickstarter into the retail distribution world. And so that's something that, PCH can help them set up a supply chain before that, again, if the scale long term is going to make sense. But that's a lot of the expertise we see on the China side is on the DFM. So, what I would say is there's definitely some local resources that can get you close to that. I think that, DFM and DFA has become a big enough topic as hardware grows that there are resources that can guide you into kind of what type of molding or some of the big pitfalls. But I think to go through a full DFM or DFA process without involving a tooling engineer from China or on the ground wherever you're manufacturing would be virtually impossible at this point. So in general, it's something, we try to give startups exposure to that early. PCH Access within PCH can help them go through that fully in China. But I think that it's hard to really have a fully tooled supply chain without engaging some deeper resources.
So that leads me to another sort of area that a lot of people are curious about. You wrote in your book, in the hardware startup, quite extensively about the teams that you need in a hardware startup. Walk us through sort of what a hardware startup team typically looks like at day one, and maybe say 6 months later and a year later.
Gosh, I think Brady had a great phrase: a hacker, a hustler.
Hackler, hustler, hipster.
There we go. Somebody who knows marketing. I think we still talk about hardware startups as if they're homogeneous, and we've been doing that today too, and that's because it's easy. But we wouldn't talk about software startups in quite the same way, right? You'd say, your B2B enterprise core team is potentially quite different than your B2C core team. You still have the same kind of personas, right? You have the engineer, you have the perhaps the visionary, you have the business and marketing person. When you add in hardware, you have to have somebody capable of understanding the construction of the physical product, the actual engineer. But at the same time, the specifications within that are often dependent on who you're going to be selling to. What your marketing team is going to look like early on. Do you need to hire somebody with a Rolodex who's going to be able to get right in and do enterprise sales if you're doing an enterprise product, or do you need someone who where you can use kind of like a scrappier growth hacker type who can just kind of create a viral, I hate that word, but viral campaign on Twitter or on Facebook. So I think that just somebody who can build the hardware, someone who can build the software, someone who can take that to market are the three kind of, I would say it's often rare to find those skill sets in the same person.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's also important to very consciously add those people as you grow your team. So, typically it's going to start with that CEO visionary that has the idea, and a lot of what we see at Highway 1 and a lot of the way that the book is framed is, let's assume that person is an MBA or maybe a software person. They have exposure to the technical world, but they have no clue how to solve their problems. So they're likely going to go out and try to find a CTO, either mechanical, electrical, firmware engineer that can help actually implement what this vision is. So that's going to kind of get them over the first hurdle. That's what's going to help them apply to accelerators, maybe get that angel round, maybe get far enough to go out for crowdfunding. But it's what I think is really interesting to see is where do people hire from there? Who's the third, fourth, fifth, seventh employee at this startup? Because I think a lot of what teams see is you have to evaluate the hardware first. This is going to be the core business. You've got to ship a few thousand of these before you can move on to the data platform play that everyone really wants to invest in. So that is to say, you probably need a couple hardware guys before you really get that software guy on full time, just building the algorithms, building the big data set that everyone's going to learn on and the investors are going to like more. So, I think, back to what we were saying earlier about, the supply chain, it's really evaluating, okay, what part of it don't we have solved? What part are investors or users or whoever we're putting in front of it saying, hey, great idea, but I don't believe this part. And really finding either a part-time or full-time resources for that. And that's something we talk about in the book a lot as well, is what makes sense as a full-time co-founder, a software developer that's going to be able to get you all the way to the big data play long-term. Hey, if they can do some embedded firmware in the meantime to get the actual device running, great. But that's going to be core to your team that's going to build a platform. Whereas something like industrial design, unless you see, a massive accessory business where you're spitting out widgets every 2 months, industrial design is something where we find it, more lean and effective to go out and engage a firm to say, hey, here's my concept, give me some outside perspective and a beautiful widget at the end of it. But industrial designer oftentimes wouldn't be the most productive second co-founder.
Yeah, and I think again, being in logistics and with some of our customers being smaller companies, I think we tend to see people hiring supply chain logistics people when they get to around 20 to 30 or so. I would say it's about where. And we've worked with some customers as they've brought that person on, which has been really interesting, seeing them kind of pull a logistics or supply chain person out of a larger company, out of Gap or some such, just someone who has experience managing multinational supply chain, and that's something that they're doing as they're thinking. That's really like a hire to scale rather than a hire to get to market. And I think that there's a lot of services out there, like I mentioned Shipwire, I mentioned Vinyard, that can. We kind of refer to ourselves sometimes as like shipping as a service or a logistics as a service, basically. Where there are providers that you can plug in, and then they will grow with you as you hire those fulfillment hires, supply chain hires, packaging designer hires, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. And is there a point? Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's also important as your team grows to have touch points internal on your team that can manage and own those external resources. So I gave a talk a few weeks ago at Mark Barris's hardware workshop about team building, and the phrase I kept using there was discipline champions. So something like design, even if you don't have an industrial design co-founder, maybe around 6 or 7 people, you hire a broad design person who can handle the industrial design being outsourced, the user experience, the app you're developing, all these 10 different design services you're going to need that you're going to have to outsource. So I think that's something, whether it be logistics, supply chain, design, things that can start to become peripheral to your business, at least having someone on your team that owns that. So the external partner has one touch point. They don't need to be going to the CEO every time a shipment is late, right? But you need someone on your team that owns that, someone that's responsible, so you can make sure you're getting the most out of that partner, and the partner knows what your team's expectations are.
So you might start with, say, a head of hardware engineering or something as employee number 3, and then that person is basically going to have the whole hardware development and supply chain side scale under them.
Yeah, and it's important to consider what their strengths and weaknesses are. If that person is your CTO and they're more of a prototype hacker and they really helped you get to that proof of concept, it works. If they're not a supply chain person, you might need to hire another supply chain person by the time it gets to that scale and let the CTO have the the flexibility to start looking at the second product, the third product, the long-term brand vision, and make sure your technology is improving as someone else sets up the supply chain. Now that all depends on how much money you raise, how risky is the supply chain, all those kind of things. But I think it's also important, teams oftentimes grow fast enough that they're not willing to kind of look internally and say, okay, what are we really good at anymore? And just kind of say, well, hey, we got 3 people, we should each take on the responsibilities and with that. So I think it's important once you hit, enough success to have that conversation to have that internally.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like a startup that's running its a software startup that's running its systems on Heroku or something, which is a little expensive once you start to get to scale, but less expensive unless you're pretty large scale than having a DevOps person on your staff. A lot of these are the same thing, or some of them are even akin more to some of those sort of HR handling services that a lot of startups rely on, where these are former core roles inside companies that have been outsourced completely to kind of a per person fee. So it's really interesting to see this stuff roll into software, roll into hardware. How long do you think it's been since that it's been possible to have a hardware startup that looks something like this, with a lot of stuff outsourced, a minimum viable product with 3 people working for a few months?
Gosh, that's a tough one. I think I was a VC before I was in logistics, and I think that just looking at the proliferation of logistics startups over the last 2 years has been really interesting, and that's it's kind of been my focus for a bit. So everything through that lens, but the number of trucking startups, just first mile, last mile, just kind of touching on these sorts of pieces of it. More and more warehousing and fulfillment startups. Just it's become a very modular process. And to your point about we have this startup stack of for software. You do your hosting and so on and so forth. I think we are starting to see that modularity move more into hardware. There are certain core functions that you cannot you really can't outsource. I mean, you can use industrial design consultancies, you can use a number of these different types of consultancies, but ultimately you have to keep some in-house. So it's figuring out what is core versus what is kind of ancillary and budgeting appropriately.
Yeah, and the example I would use on the engineering side is really Tech Shop as the first opportunity to start to lighten some of that burden on the engineering prototyping side. So until the rise of Tech Shop, I mean, there's always prototyping houses, job shops for making 5, 10, 50 of something. So there's always been vendors available, but I think the ability to have a prototyping vendor available where an engineer can walk up, after a class, use a mill, and now they don't have to buy a mill for their startup. They don't put that calculation into their first raise to say, well, we're a hardware startup, and because we're doing medical, we need all these machines. Oh, and we need a mill and a lathe and a water jet, and a brake press, and all these things. And now they can say, well, hey, we're medical, so we need these 3 chambers. We don't have to buy all these extra tools anymore. We can go to Tech Shop. So that's really the example I would see on the engineering side, where it's the first thing that I looked up and said, hey, that's really cool. That's different. I think that's made everything more accessible, and then also just gotten the mind share out there that things should be accessible. These aren't crazy dangerous machines that take 10 hours to learn. This is something that everyone should be able to get access to and start making as soon as they can.
Sorry, go ahead, Renee.
Some of the this is like a whole other conversation, but the future of the factory startups, more like companies like Plethora that are sort of rethinking the CAD as an IDE and sort of troubleshooting in the design process, and kind of the click to buy it winds up in your mailbox 3 days later kind of thing. Which right now is kind of at small scale, but really interesting technology there. And you go out to their factory, it's fascinating to see how few people actually run it. I mean, it's just, it's machines running machines.
Yeah, it's the about sort of the Tech Shop idea, or the accessible prototyping tools, that I think is exciting at a really fundamental level as well, is that it makes developing hardware prototypes something that can be sort of creative and intuitive and iterative. It shortens the distance between the creative person and the prototype, right? Anyone who's designed a website knows that it's much easier to be creative if you're actually design, like writing the website yourself than it is if you're submitting Jira tickets of the website. Hey, let's try this in blue. 8 hours later, it comes back in blue. You're like, never mind, go back to red. 8 hours later, it comes back in red. You know, this is the equivalent of that, right? You can have someone who's like generally a hardware engineer or an industrial designer, and rather than like, you know, coming up with a pretty complete idea in AutoCAD, shipping it off, waiting 2 days for it to come back, you're putting your hands on it and experimenting with it.
And one thing that I think that brings up is the importance of brand, actually, because I had a wearable side project that I've been kind of tooling around with, and I'm not a hardware engineer. My background's software, computer science, and same with my husband. But we bought this Ambient Labs prototyping kit. It's just and I was like, great. You know, it arrived without the battery even soldered on, and I thought, oh my god. We had a friend have a soldering iron small enough. He came over. We like did it on the dining room table. You know, it was with a lithium-ion battery. We had no business doing this whatsoever, but we did. But the point is, it was basically like a fully functional, all the sensors were there, wearable, right out of, like, it just arrived. You know, it just came in the mail, and there it was. And so with no hardware experience whatsoever, with our pathetic soldering, we were still able to get something up and running that mimicked a lot of the functionality of a lot of the wearables on the market. And the thing that really drove home to me was, one, I paid like $40 for this kit, and that was like full retail for, you know, basically a board and a battery. But you know, you can imagine this is like it's effectively like full commoditization of the platform at that point. So if I have a hardware, like a wearable company, like what are my differentiators at that point? It's certainly not these sensors. It's certainly not the expertise it takes to get to a functional product. So what it is at that point, it becomes the design, right? It's the look and feel. It's the it's the unboxing. It's the industrial design. It's the beauty, and it's also the emphasis on developing for a customer, developing with a customer in mind. Because again, this $40 be all things, all people sort of thing. It's just this blank canvas. And then you look at that, and what that drove home to me was you really have to know who you're manufacturing for, what your product is, and then tie your branding and marketing and pricing and everything to that. So that's where I think a lot of times we as technologists emphasize the technology when the thing that's going to kill you is not it's really hard to get this sensor stuck to that board. It's actually how do I take this idea and get it onto a shelf?
Well, the thing I would build on that also is what do people actually do with this data in the long term? Like, what's the user interface? What's the actionable insight, right? Like wearables is the perfect example where we have people come to Highway 1 all the time and say, I've got this new sensor, I just want to get it on people's wrists, and it's going to be awesome. We're just going to build this mountain of data, and these algorithms are going to pop out of it, and it's going to be great, and we're going to figure that out later. And we say, great, totally buy that as a business model. Like Renee said, we're technologists, so we can kind of see that future. Explain that to the first layman. Like, what's the first killer use case? What's the first really awesome use of that data? The first time your phone pops up and said, hey, you haven't been running today, go running. Whatever the actual actionable advice is that comes out of that is, I think, something that entrepreneurs miss because they're so deep in their first idea and they've solved their own problem that they get like, well, hey, I get how I could use this. Why doesn't everyone else? And then, we say, well, I'm sure they will. Just help explain it to them. You need to meet them halfway. And long term, yes, people are going to be using this thing as a great, development kit. They're going to be, creating their own algorithms and, giving you comments to say, hey, you thought it was just for running. I'm using it for swimming. This is how it works. And, the community will start to build your platform for you. But I think sometimes entrepreneurs underestimate how much they need to seed that first killer use case.
Yeah. They've been sitting in the cave for a couple of months, soldering things into boards, and in that time, it's pretty easy to rationalize what you're doing and understand it at such a fundamental level that you can't imagine explaining it to someone else.
Yeah.
So in the last 4 minutes here, both of you are speaking at Solid. I'd love to just have you say what you're talking about and sort of give us a very brief run through. Renee?
I am speaking about the future of logistics and supply chain with practical applications for hardware companies, basically. So talking about both on a broad level, the trends that are reshaping supply chain logistics, and then at an extremely practical level, what you can do to, if you're manufacturing overseas, get your goods here efficiently and cheaply.
Cool. So I'm talking about, the title is 2D versus 3D versus 4D prototyping, finding the right resolution for the right prototype. So a lot of it is about how to productively use iterative prototyping and the tools available to quickly learn about your project before you turn it into a product for Kickstarter. So a lot of it is defining, what the heck is a 2D or 4D prototype, and a lot of it will be around using 2D prototyping more heavily with foam core, and really learning in 2D before entrepreneurs move to 3D printers and start making what they think they want. So basically low resolution prototyping and how to lower the risk in your prototyping cycle.
Excellent. Both of those are really incredible topics, things that a lot of the community that comes to conferences like Solid has never been able to approach at this kind of granularity and with this kind of ease before. So, things like dealing with a supply chain, things like going through a whole prototyping process. I guess we haven't been able to come up with a firm number for how many years ago this all changed, and I think we tend to probably be a little too aggressive in saying that things are completely new, but it does feel like this stuff is new. Like a few years ago, doing this kind of prototyping or setting up a supply chain would have required a lot more kind of old school expertise, and now it's just it's a very fluid and exciting thing. So thank you very much again for joining us today. Your book, The Hardware Startup, I'll just repeat it once more, The Hardware Startup. Very proud to have published it at O'Reilly. You can find it as an ebook or a print book at O'Reilly.com or Amazon.com or anywhere else that fine books are sold. We'll have a few copies at the Solid Conference, which is next week, June 23 to 25 at Fort Mason in San Francisco. A handful of tickets are still available for the conference if you want to hear Renee and Ryan speak. And Renee and Ryan and the third co-author, Brady Forrest, who's the director of the Highway 1 incubator at PCH, will all be at Solid to talk about their book as well. So I hope everyone will come and join us there. If you enjoyed this conversation, you would certainly enjoy The Hardware Startup, the book that Renee and Ryan and Brady wrote, and as well as the Solid Conference. So thank you both so much.
Thank you, John.
Great, thank you, John.